Welcome to the Crypto Traders Podcast, simplifying cryptocurrency for traders and investors around the world. Subscribe for interviews with developers, market updates, and a professional look at the future of money. You've come to trust Matthew and Kurt to filter out the noise across social media. Now you can listen on the go. Without further ado, here's the Crypto Traders Podcast.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Crypto Traders Podcast, available at cryptotraderspro.com. You can also subscribe on YouTube, as well as iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google, Amazon, and everywhere else in the universe where you can consume the podcast media. Today, our guest is Steve Shadders, who's the lead technical director over at nChain, and he's the head of the BSV project, the Bitcoin Satoshi Vision project. He works directly with Craig Wright and is one of the advisors on mining to a bunch of the SV mining pools. He's an expert on Bitcoin. He's an expert on SHA-256 mining. And we go into a whole bunch of stuff. We talk a little bit about the hash war. We talk about what the culture at nChain is like, what it's like to work with Craig Wright on a daily basis, and just how much has been going on in the BSV community. We touched on hand cash, and we touched on White Rabbit and UnRighter jumping into the community and creating a bunch of cool stuff. And we talked a little bit about why CTOR and TTOR are conceptually different and why one is desirable over another. We also touched on Teranode and the gigablock network and a whole bunch of other stuff. We also touched base on who Steve is as a person and learned a little bit about his guinea pig, which makes an appearance on the video version if you're watching the video version on YouTube. So without any further delay, let's get into the interview. Steve Shadders, thanks for joining us today. What is your, let's just start with like who you are. What's your deal? I know you work for nChain, but what other hats do you wear around the BSV universe?
Well, I guess that's one of the ones I'm most well known for. I've been involved in protocol discussions on Bitcoin back when it was Bitcoin Cash since early last year. I've been involved in Bitcoin since 2011. Had a little holiday from Bitcoin for a couple of years, but came back in 2017. I guess now one of my primary roles outside of being an nChain staffer is I'm technical director of the Bitcoin SV project, and I'm also trying to do a lot of work around Bitcoin SV infrastructure. So it's not just confined to the Bitcoin node software itself. I'm interested in finding other support services that are required by the ecosystem so that businesses can build on top of SV.
Cool, very cool. So in the grand hierarchy of people who are influential in the SV universe from a software standpoint, would you like who should be reaching out to you basically if they've got a question or something to work on? What would be a role that you wish more people would approach you to work on?
Well, I'm interested in anybody who wants to integrate their products with BSV. You know, we have a really healthy ecosystem, I think, already, and we've got it's made up of applications and products that are really backed by a commitment to actually turning it into a business. So anybody who needs some assistance with that sort of thing, by all means reach out. I may not necessarily be the best person to walk you through individual technical details because there's only so many hours in the day, but certainly help or put you in touch with people internally from the Bitcoin SV team that can help with stuff.
Great.
Yeah, it's actually something that's on my radar to improve early this year. So last year, the focus was really getting getting Bitcoin SV out the door and ready for November 15, and we had a really exhausted team after that, leading into Christmas. So the new year really was a kind of a fresh start for us, where we could say, okay, let's focus on some of the more interesting stuff and focus on building stuff outside of just the raw Bitcoin SV code.
Sure. Very cool. So one of the things I've noticed is that in the split, the BCH split, I was a big BCH advocate, and when the split started to kind of fracture and show some of the cracks in the community, I was pretty neutral actually. I have friends on both sides, people I respect on both sides, and then it seemed like the philosophy, like the kind of the worldview stuff started to split, and then the technical stuff started to come out. But in your opinion, is like the SV versus ABC stuff more philosophical, or is it more technical, or what do you think? What are your thoughts on that?
Philosophical is probably the word I would lean towards. It's a little bit of both, but I mean, the outcome of it really did us one big favor on the SV side. I guess I've described it like this in the past. On August 1st, was it? I think 2017. Bitcoin Cash was born. Usually we say that that it split off from the Bitcoin chain, but I prefer to think that BTC had a protocol change and split themselves off with Sechet. Sure. And that achieved something that a whole bunch of people had in common, which was it got us past the limit of 1 meg blocks, and you had a very large ecosystem full of people with diverse views on other things. We probably at that time didn't even know what their views were on how Bitcoin should go forward, because they'd all been just focused on this one issue for so long. So they agreed on all of that, but as it turned out, not much else. So protocol direction was something that just became a hot potato for quite some time. And right now, in Bitcoin SV, we have a whole collection of people that are actually agreed on the future roadmap for the protocol, which is to put it back the way that it was originally and give it a chance to be what it was. And part of the reason I'm really keen to do that is because I think Bitcoin as a system that combines economics and cryptography and code together, as well as human behavior, has a certain set of properties which in Bitcoin's very early days, the volume simply wasn't there to exercise those properties and give it a shot to actually see if it worked. So I don't think Bitcoin's ever actually been really tested yet. And that's what I kind of aim to do. Sure. What I would like to see done. So I guess the key philosophical difference really is people that actually just want to leave the protocol alone, and which don't. I think if I had to choose which one I would prefer to be working in, it's the one that doesn't want to mess around with the protocol, because my experience of being involved in a group of developers in Bitcoin Cash was that we wasted an awful lot of time arguing about the protocol. Now they've still got that problem. On the other hand, pretty much everyone's aligned on Bitcoin SV on that issue.
I think it's interesting.
The reason for that is because we telegraphed that, and it was very well known long in advance before Bitcoin SV chain became separate from the ABC chain. So everyone knew what they were getting, and everyone chose to come along because they thought, yep, that's fine. Sure.
Yeah, I always say, I've been involved in Bitcoin since 2012. I'm not a super technical guy, but I come at it from philosophical stuff and kind of an entrepreneurial standpoint. So for me, it's always like, it's use case, it's scalability, but it's predictability. As a business person, predictability really matters. And that really resonated with me from day one with Craig and kind of his internet presence, is that like, hey, we need to be actually reaching out to businesses and let businesses know we're not going to, shift the ground under their feet every 6 months. So I liked that. During the scaling debate, like 2014, 2015, I basically took my hiatus from Bitcoin too, because I just thought it was crazy. And I got into Monero, and I did some research into, Dash, and I think Digibyte did some really cool stuff with, multi-shield. And I liked all those things conceptually, but I always was like, when do we get back to Bitcoin? When do we get back to Satoshi's vision? And my question is why do you think it's so controversial to say maybe the white paper was right, maybe Satoshi was right?
I honestly, I don't know. It does baffle me somewhat that it's a source of controversy. I think if you consider the arguments that were had over the last part of last year, much of the controversy was not actually over this question at all. It was over a particular personality that a bunch of people had a bug up their butts about, to be honest.
Yeah.
No, I don't know. I don't think it's a controversial thing, nor should it be.
Right.
If other people want to go and build blockchains with different sets of rules, go for it. Give it a crack. I don't think it'll work or last long term, but
right.
I don't care if you go and do it. So why do you care what we're doing here with Bitcoin?
Sure, absolutely. Do you think? I mean, all of that aside, all those other communities, whatever. I think a lot of them actually generally mean well, and the ones that are actually developing something that they think matters, I take them seriously at their word, at least. But when I talk to the Bitcoin Core folks, like I have this deep seated like pit in my stomach that I feel like they're all basically the bad guy. And and it's I can't believe how many they blocked by Samson Mao or blocked by Pierre Rochard or all the, just by having straight up conversations, asking legitimate questions, and then being called an idiot, or it turns into point and laugh rather than address the question. Do you think is there a top down conspiracy? Is there a Blockstream conspiracy, or do you think they're just their own echo chamber and they just created their own culture that way?
Well, I mean, they do very much have a culture, and once a belief takes hold in a culture, it's very difficult for new entrants not to adopt that belief. Otherwise, they get chased out. Is there a conspiracy? Well, I mean, there's certainly been some coordinated actions to control narrative, which has led to I guess the justification of certain decisions. To be honest, I don't spend a lot of time thinking about Bitcoin Core. There was one thing that I think Bitcoin Cash did well, which was it didn't take them too long. Maybe it took them about a year to stop worrying about Bitcoin Core.
Sure.
And get on with their own business. I think that Bitcoin SV should do the same. We've got a ton of stuff to build, a lot of work to do, a lot of people really keen to do it. So we should just focus our attention on the future.
Sure.
And leave them to do. We'll leave any past conflicts behind.
Sure. I like that. I think that's probably wise for a number of reasons. On that note, everybody wants to hear like what's it like to work with Craig, and I'm a little less interested in that than most. I'm curious, like, what is the rest of the staff like? What's the nChain culture like?
There are a lot of people in the Bitcoin world who are very, very smart people. So I think it's probably fair to say that there's a lot of people out there who might be seeing this, who've had the experience of spending most of their life being the smartest guy or the smartest girl in the room. You walk into the nChain office and that's not true anymore. And a bit of a blow to the ego, I guess, at first. But if you can get past that, it's actually an absolute privilege to be able to work amongst such a large collection of extraordinarily intelligent people. I mean, we've got everything from math PhDs to engineers that understand C++ in a level of detail that blows my mind. So I'm just never short of a really fascinating, stimulating kind of conversation.
Sure.
And one thing I actually really love about nChain is we have fostered this culture of encouraging people to be wrong, or not encouraging them to be wrong, but making it okay to be wrong.
Sure.
That means you can have much more productive workshop discussions. sit there with a group of people and throw ideas around, and no one's ever going to hesitate to put an idea out because they think it might sound dumb. I love dumb ideas because in exploring them and trying to articulate why they're dumb, you often triggers another one. So I just love the kind of creative problem solving atmosphere.
Awesome.
That's around the office.
So would that imply, like, is Craig not a micromanager? Does he let everybody play, or how involved is he in kind of everyone's business around?
Craig's not involved, I guess, on the day-to-day basis. He comes into the nChain office a few times a week. But whatever Craig's doing, he's usually sitting there writing notes at the same time. He's an incredible multitasker. At first, it's a bit off-putting because you think he's not listening to you. He's just walked in and started ignoring you. But he knows exactly what's going on in any conversation, and just randomly out of the blue, he'll pipe up, probably not even look up from his phone or his notepad, and make a comment which is articulate, explains. It shows that he clearly knows what we've been talking about in detail. So I think people do have we certainly have some scope to play because we've got to foster that creativity. There are a certain set of parameters I think that nChain does tend to work within. So we have the philosophy of just leave the protocol as it is. So solve problems within that set of constraints. And some people come into nChain at first and they find that difficult because you sort of think about a problem. How do I solve this problem? And there are solutions out there that involve new opcode or whatever.
Right.
It's the first place your mind tends to go. So it takes a little bit of adjusting the way of thinking to go, no, don't solve it within these constraints.
Sure.
And I think as a result of that, they actually come up with solutions that people wouldn't come up with were the constraints not there. So yeah, we've seen some really interesting ways of using script, etc., from some of our research team, and a whole bunch of stuff that I think we probably wouldn't have seen otherwise.
Yeah, no, that's cool. One of the things that stands out is like just how much Craig and a number of people were talking about. Like, if we let the protocol be the protocol, then people will want to develop on it. And I thought that was an interesting assumption because to me, the developers that I've met in my life want to be able to tinker. And locked protocol, I think a lot of people misunderstood what that actually meant. And almost immediately after the split, we got UnRighter, who wrote this amazing Medium piece about why SV is the development panacea. And now we've got White Rabbit that popped up on Twitter and just decided to, jump in and create a bunch of crazy stuff too, and play a bunch of games with the stuff that you can build on top of it. What are your thoughts on those two players and people that are, anonymous and playing off of each other and building all kinds of, databasing tools and sockets and connecting things? Do you think we're going to see a bunch more of that quickly, or are they just a?
I certainly hope so, because I think UnRighter's brought some great tools as well as a very entertaining bit of mystique to White Rabbit's someone I've only just sort of become aware of in recent days. In fact, and I don't know. I have spent a little bit of time speculating about who UnRighter might be. Might be someone we actually know, who's projected or created this sort of alternate persona. It's not me. I've thought about it. I don't have the time to create an alternate persona.
Sure.
But yeah, I mean, the creative outputs are fantastic. I like the writing style as well. It's quite entertaining. And I hope they continue. I hope they set a template for others.
Sure.
Because they're producing useful outputs. Don't care if they're anonymous or not.
Right. I just think it's fun. White Rabbit actually reached out to me on Twitter because I put together that hand cash ping a penny thing, sort of because I was bored and I knew we'd be having a blizzard here in Chicago. So it was like, well, I'm going to be stuck in the house, so let's play a hand cash game on Twitter. And she reached out to me like, I'm going to bang out this API. I'm going to do all this stuff. And just, I probably got 500 messages from her on Twitter DMs. And I'm like, yeah, sure. Help. That's great. And just like banged out all this stuff and connected my name as a trigger for the API to send pennies around. And like, hey, cool. Like
I had a few pop into my Cash wallet too, actually.
Okay.
I started getting notifications. So someone worked out my hand, probably Shadders.
That's funny. So let's talk a little more technical. One of the things that is, I think, confusing to a lot of people is why there isn't replay protection right now. And I've speculated, I made a video in November about maybe Operation Dragon Slayer, that kind of thing. And that was a bit of me making a prediction. And if it happened, I'd be super famous. But it didn't play out the way that I thought it would play out. But I still kind of feel like the hash war is technically ongoing as long as transactions are replaying on both chains, in my opinion. Do you think, I mean, is it just like we're going to implement replay protection and move on? Or is there still a play for like, hey, let's see if Bitmain just completely pulls their hash and let's see what happens?
I don't have any intention of spending much of my attention on what Bitcoin ABC are doing. I just want us to get on with things. On the replay protection issue, it's a tricky one. There's been some quite strong resistance to that within the Bitcoin SV community. It's probably the one last issue that remains a little bit contentious. So I don't think it's something that we need to hurry.
Right.
You know, the Electrum SV has a coin splitting tool built into it now, so you can do a one-click split.
Sure.
There's numerous ways that people can do that. Having said that, I think going into the future, thinking about a user who might pop up, in a year's time or 2 years' time, not necessarily being aware of much of the history there, shouldn't be the case that they should be accidentally splitting. Having transactions replayed just because they're not aware. And we can address that at different ways. We can address that. One end of the spectrum is hard replay protection, which is a massively disruptive consensus change because you don't have to just upgrade nodes, you upgrade all the wallets, everything in the whole ecosystem. There's the other end, which is soft replay protection, where wallets can just use custom transaction types. And if all the wallets have that built into them, then it's probably everybody who needs to be protected will be protected, which is basically users who aren't deliberately trying to do replayed transactions because they've got the technical background to do so. So yeah, we've got a couple of proposals on how we can do that long term and make it, shall we say, optional but default behavior.
Okay.
Which I guess I'll start to circulate and get some feedback on that in the next few weeks. Yeah.
Does it?
As far as hash war is still going on, I mean, if ABC and if Bitcoin Cash didn't exist today, it's always an interesting question. Technically, Bitcoin is a hash war. It's a constant hash war.
Right.
Participants might be different, but it's about a bunch of miners competing with each other for long games. So
that's interesting. I think a lot of people really misunderstand. I think almost everybody misunderstands what the hell mining even is. But especially SV is a minority on SHA-256 and that kind of thing. So like as a miner, do you have to proactively not mine BTC in order to mine BSV, that kind of thing? Or how active, or I guess how proactive versus reactive do you have to be? Like if you're just simply running a BSV node and pointing hash that way, is there ever crossover? People were talking yesterday about occasionally BU nodes and ABC nodes will still kind of reconnect into the SV universe and that kind of thing. How fluid is it to, just for example, like, hey, I want to mine BTC for an hour. Is that like a click one button on the keyboard, or does somebody actually need to sit and do a bunch of work?
No. It should be relatively simple if you get everything set up properly. I mean, there's different types of miners, I guess. There's large miners that run on their own private mining pools. There's small miners who join public pools. Usually, it's just a matter of switching which pool they're pointing to. If you want to switch from one to another, many mining pools have got auto switching built into them as well. So. It's not complicated. I mean, if you've got 100 or 200,000 miners, you probably want to have them all feeding through a central point that you can then control and switch one time. Because if you have to log into, a lot of miners use Raspberry Pis as controllers.
Sure.
You've got to log into 200,000 of those to switch an IP address, and it's going to get a bit cumbersome. Miners have been dealing with this problem for quite a long time, because even back in the very early days, there were changes in the profitability of different mining pools for various reasons, depending on what types of payout systems they used. Whether the miner wanted to try out a bit of pool hopping. So they had this need to be able to switch from pool to pool for many years. So they're quite good at doing that.
Sure. So another technical question. SV holds the world record for the biggest blocks ever mined with proof of work. All that's impressive, but the big criticism was, but it took 30 or 40 minutes to propagate the network, or it orphaned first, that kind of thing. And this was the ABC, like, we need Avalanche, pre-consensus, CTOR. This is why we went that direction. Can you explain SV's position on, like, is a 30 or 40 minute propagation time a problem, first of all? And if it's not, can you explain why it is good or desirable?
No, it's not desirable. Certainly not. Is it a problem? Well, the question is, did the block propagate amongst the miners faster than that, or is it just some edge node out on the edge of the network that took too long to get it because it's not densely connected to the network?
Right.
If that's the case, and I mean, the people that are usually spouting the long propagation times are notorious for running tiny nodes, so that doesn't actually surprise me. But certainly we need to focus on that and get block propagation as fast as possible.
Sure.
Is CTOR necessary to it? No, absolutely not. It's actually almost problematic in some respects when it comes to transaction propagation. Eliminating the topological order makes certain things a little more complicated, because if you think about topological ordering, is where if a transaction has a parent that it depends on, that spends from that parent, and that parent's not confirmed, the parent must appear before the child. Now, if you send a child transaction to a Bitcoin node that hasn't seen the parent, from that node's point of view, you're trying to spend an output that doesn't actually exist.
Right.
So that's a valid transaction. By default, there's a very, very tiny pool where they'll just pop that transaction into a pool and on the hope that maybe the parent will come along later and they'll reconnect it. But it's by default, it's only like 100. So the most efficient way to propagate transactions is to make sure that they go out in topological order.
Right.
And as it happens, because that just happens to be the way that Bitcoin orders things, it makes things much smoother, I guess, on the peer-to-peer network.
Right.
So I honestly, I'm not at all concerned about not having the features of CTOR. We've been working through with a design group on the Teranode concept, working through a whole bunch of different problems, and at no point has the topological ordering actually become problematic for us in working through different design elements for Teranode. In fact, it's been beneficial in lots of ways. So, yeah.
So, one of the things I do fundamental analysis for a group of traders and investment hedge fund stuff. And my fundamental analysis is what made me a Bitcoiner. It's what made me a Bitcoin casher. It's what's made me a BSV advocate. And I always have to explain to people the value of inefficiency, because people are like, well, why wouldn't we just go with Stellar or Ripple and they can already do 2,000 transactions a second or whatever? And I have to explain the value of the inefficiency of proof of work, that work is necessary to create value. And I think that's a concept that a lot of people don't understand. And I feel like that's a lot what Craig and yourself and a number of the others that kind of understand this stuff at a high level talk about value being created there, and that this perceived inefficiency is actually beneficial. So can you explain just briefly, like, what is the value of topological transaction ordering versus CTOR? Is there a specific thing? Is there like a one thing that you can point to and say, like, this is why we can't break TTOR?
Look, I did go back to the very original code because I had a theory that TTOR was actually embedded in the original code, or part of the original Satoshi code. Oh, actually, I wasn't 100% sure. So firstly, I want to go back and verify that was the case, and it is. And I had a couple of developers look at this, not all of them from inside of nChain, and said, asked them to speculate on this. Do you think this was done because it's actually just the easiest way to implement it? Or does it look like it was a deliberate decision? Most of them came back and said, we couldn't put our finger on why, but it actually did look like it was a deliberate decision. Yeah, I don't really know the reason specifically for it, other than, I mean, it does make implementation of a whole bunch of things easier. It also makes logical sense to see things in some kind of a time order. If as I described before, if I see the child before I've seen the parent, basically what I've got is a piece of junk data. It's no use to me. Present it again to the Bitcoin engine, which is what Bitcoin actually does, internally in a bucket, and then it waits for this parent to come along, and then it represents it to the validation engine, it goes through and kind of makes sense.
Sure.
Yeah, it also turns, I guess, Bitcoin blocks essentially into, I guess, a kind of a stream, because there is a natural ordering to them. A lot of the arguments around why TTOR is inefficient are complete nonsense, because talk about sorting algorithms and things to make sure it's in the right order. Well, you can't put them into the mempool in any other order other than TTOR, so you've already got all this ordering information there.
Yeah, I
think the one people really think about when they talk about CTOR is stuff like graphene, fast block propagation. And that basically gets around having to send a bunch of information by a handy encoding that relies on miners agreeing on the ordering information in advance. Having said that, I don't understand why you can't just send a 1-byte flag that says, okay, I've ordered my block in this particular type of order. That saves you then having to transmit that. If that was the approach you wanted to take. But it's also a bit of a limited way of thinking, because there's other ways that you can do this. You've been transmitting data across the network constantly over 10 minutes. And if you don't want the other person to see, encrypt the damn stuff. And then at the end of the block, they've got this stream of encrypted transaction IDs. You send them the public key, send them the encryption key, and they can de-encrypt it. So they haven't got any advanced warning, they haven't got any pre-consensus, I suppose, but the data itself has moved from one place to the other, and just giving the means of unlocking it. That's one approach we're looking at.
Sure. I mean, it makes sense. As much of any of it makes sense, I think. So what's next? You mentioned Teranode. I talked to Daniel really briefly yesterday. Daniel Connolly was talking about the gigablock network and all these things. Are these things, I guess, what's going to be rephrase. What is going to be the biggest difference between the Bitcoin SV of today versus the Bitcoin SV of, say, 2 or 5 years in the future?
Mm-hmm. I guess fundamentally, Bitcoin D is monolithic, and we want Teranode to be, we want Bitcoin to be not monolithic. So we are breaking down all of the transaction flows, I guess, that we're starting with the mapping out the whole life cycle of the transaction from creation to validation, embedding in a block confirmation, becoming a bunch of UTXOs, and then eventually them ending up being spent, at which point the transaction sort of ceases to have any meaning other than historical significance.
Sure.
So all of those processes, we're working through ways to make them essentially a bunch of tiny little microservices, and we want to treat everything as you design everything initially to be single-threaded, but not have dependencies on other instances of this service. Then you can run 100 of them or 1,000 of them or whatever. You get your kind of multi-threading effect out of it that way.
Sure.
So you'll see, I think Bitcoin will be a lot of very structured internally as a lot of very small discrete components, and not the monstrosity, I guess, that it is today.
Sure.
The gigablock testnet, I think, is something worth talking about, because in fact, I think Daniel's probably publishing something about it this evening. We've been doing a lot of work on that over the last couple of months, and in fact, we've got a new release of Bitcoin SV coming out very soon, which has all the gigablock testnet functionality enabled. We're actually renaming it to the scaling testnet, because cool. We feel that gigablock is limiting ourselves unnecessarily. We may well be going well past gigablock.
I like it. So that's cool. So will they essentially be different software implementations on the network then? Is that the concept in brief, or am I misunderstanding it? Yeah.
The Bitcoin SV software as it stands now can only take us so far with fixes because of its overall design. There's lots of bits of the Bitcoin software that I think can be taken and wrapped up inside microservices, so we don't necessarily have to rewrite all of it. But I think you're essentially going to be looking at a new implementation. So the real challenge with doing that is making sure that one is consensus compatible with another.
Right.
And this is the problem I've been thinking about since probably 2014.
Sure.
There's a few records of some heated conversations with Mike Hearn out there on the internet about adamantly against the idea of re-implementing the Bitcoin node software. But there's a few things I think that you can do. But the key thing is to actually understand the Bitcoin protocol properly, because it's not specified. There's no spec for it at all, other than the current code. So we've got a project that got to about 80% complete, and then got stalled last year, which is to do a protocol spec. Once that's done, the next step for us is to take every single rule that's in that spec and turn it into a set of test cases. So we'll end up with a comprehensive test suite of protocol compatibility. That won't be a perfect tool. There's probably some quirks or whatever that might slip through, but it'll be definitely a good starting point for alternate implementations to test against.
Cool.
And be able to see how close they are to actually implementing consensus compatibility.
Interesting. So, a lot of BTC people talk about the halving that's coming up. We're about a year away from it now, and then we got another one coming 4 years after that. And they're all very excited because I think the halving subsidy getting smaller automatically translates to a growth in value of their BTC, which I think is bizarre. But I think that we absolutely need to have big blocks full of transactions so that fees can create a self-sustaining network. How do we get there? I mean, we have 2,000 coins that about 99.9% we don't need for anything. They aren't used for anything except speculation. There's maybe 3 to 5 coins that actually have some business use, but how do we get from 2,000 coins to, maybe 3 to 5 functional coins before these block halvings kind of nuke everybody?
Yeah, well, actually, there must be something going on in social media or something about this issue, because it's the third time that's brought up to me today. I don't think you can look at past behavior to predict how price will be impacted around the next halvening, because you've only got a sample of 2 events.
Right.
So it's not very conclusive. I mean, in terms of how do we get to the volumes that we need, there's a couple of responses, I guess, that would come from miners if the halvening happened and the transaction fees haven't actually replaced the lost revenue. One would be some miners will start switching off, and the economics are such that when revenues drop below a certain threshold, miners do start to switch off until the difficulty drops, until basically you reach an equilibrium point again. It doesn't happen overnight, because lots of miners have fixed term power contracts and whatnot. So if they're paying for the power anyway, they might as well get some revenue, even if it's not enough to cover costs. They get none and still have to pay the same costs. But it does happen over time. But we do need to think about how we drive volume on Bitcoin, and it'll come from a few different sources. I think payments are one, and then the obvious one. Payments are a bit difficult because they're a bit of a chicken and egg type problem. One of the biggest barriers, I guess, is volatility, price volatility, to adoption for someone who's not passionate about Bitcoin. They just want a payment tool. And you get rid of volatility by increasing use, but you can't. But volatility is the barrier to increase use. So I actually think that the initial volume is going to come from other sources. My guess is there'll be some tokenized fiat currencies popping up in the over the next year. Tokens for many other things will to on-chain volume. The Metanet project, which I'm sure we'll talk about in a bit, has plenty of potential. And something that's I guess will be coming in the next little while. I've had a bit of a discussion with miners about and with our internal team about getting rid of the opera term limits. I know there's people who've got a ton of demand for storing data on the blockchain. So we might start to see significantly sized blocks with quite a small amount of transaction volume, and then hopefully eventually a much larger amount of transaction volume. So once you drive volume, I think, from these other types of sources, that then starts to contribute to dropping the volatility of the price. You've actually got a valuation that's based on underlying use, and I guess the market becomes a lot more the markets fiat to Bitcoin exchanges, etc., become a lot more liquid, and that's when the people that don't really care about Bitcoin that might be able to make use of it are probably going to be more willing to come in and play around.
Makes sense. So you mentioned miners shutting off, and it's typically the miners that are not well connected, or they just they're hobbyists, or they were hobbyists that were trying to become a good mining business, but they aren't quite there yet. So when they've got that problem of the halving, and they weren't really that profitable before, they're shutting off. Do you think, is there a role right now for people to be getting into the mining business from a low level? Like, should your average person be buying ant miners or whatever to try to jump in on this stuff, or is that ship kind of sailed?
Look, it depends on a whole lot of things, not least of which is the cost of power in the place you're living in. But we're moving towards a world where margins for mining are starting to become thinner. And in that scenario where a halvening or any other reason that impacts the Bitcoin price below the level of profitability, the first people to switch off out of the ones that can
Right.
are the ones that have the highest cost base.
Sure.
Because the cost base is not the same for everybody. So whilst it might be unprofitable for this miner, there's another miner down here with a lower cost base who's actually still making a profit while this guy's losing money.
Sure.
So, I mean, but in terms of, small home miners, I mean, they're going to be competing against economies of scale.
Right.
If there's a fat margin in it, then I guess there's space there for someone who's got a higher cost base to get in and still earn some money. But
Sure.
with the margins, I would expect margins for mining to get pretty tight as volume increases, because it will simply become more competitive.
Right.
Miners will be competing for your transactions by offering lower fees.
Yeah. So one more question. Before we get on to Metanet, because I'd like a couple of things clarified from your position, but this whole Squire CoinGeek thing, I think is super exciting. I was really excited to see basically them becoming the largest publicly traded Bitcoin miner ever. And that's not Bitcoin SV or Bitcoin Cash. It'll be the largest Bitcoin. It's the largest SHA-256 partnership that is a public company in the history of Bitcoin. I think you have a role there as well. I think they gave you a title to do some work over there too. I'm curious, what will the motivation is it going to be a lot of hardware innovation, or what's the basic roadmap for Squire and CoinGeek over the next let's say 1 to 3 years?
Well, I guess I should clarify. I do offer advice to them, but very much do their own thing and
okay.
across everything that goes on there, or even their kind of long-term plan. But based on what I've seen, it's technological innovation to basically create the most efficient and performant mining rigs that they can. Based on numbers I've seen, it's looking like they're probably going to be ahead of pretty much all of the other competitors in the market. But I mean, it's an interesting strategic place to be, and I think it probably says a lot about the people behind it, their intentions and their beliefs for the future of Bitcoin, that they're making this massive investment.
Right.
This area, because if you don't have some confidence in the future of Bitcoin, then putting together infrastructure for building mining doesn't make a lot of sense. So.
Sure. So, all right, the question everybody, I polled some people to say, hey, what should I ask Steve? And one of the most popular ones was like, what the heck is Metanet? I think it's like the super ethereal concept that everybody assumes Craig is just making stuff up as he goes. I don't think that's where Craig's head is at, but could you give some clarity for somebody who maybe has a limited concept as to what even Bitcoin is and what Metanet is in relation to Bitcoin? But like, let's assume we're talking to senior citizens and middle school children.
Look, I'll preface this by saying I'm not the Metanet expert by any means. In fact, I've had some briefings on it recently, which made a few things click into place for me. But I first heard about this last year when Craig got back from he was supposed to be on holiday. He spent the whole time writing up papers for this Metanet thing. And he came back and he was very excited about it and explained it to me, and I looked at him blankly and I don't understand what you're talking about. So it's been through the research team now, and they've parsed it, I guess, and turned it into something a bit more meaningful. As a general concept, it is quite abstract. It's the idea of putting stuffing data on the blockchain, and most of us probably don't think that's hard because we have op-return type transactions. But there's a bunch of ideas around it, for indexing and being able to show chains of ownership for content, being able to give permission for things, to be able to own, I guess, a piece of internet real estate and grant or deny permission via the blockchain. And I guess Metanet really needs a concrete use case because it is so abstract. It needs a concrete use case so that you can demonstrate it to people, even though they may not get what the underlying principles are, but they can at least sort of see it doing something and starting to work. So I believe that we'll be seeing some material coming out of nChain, the research arm, sometime in the next couple of months, which should explain it in terms of a concrete use case. I'm honestly not the best person to go through it. We have a particular interest in it in my engineering team, though, because we are working on an implementation of a VDI, electronic data interchange, and Metanet is the perfect platform to put something like that on. We're doing that because we recognize it as a potential to drive insane amounts of transaction volume on Bitcoin, as well as the fact that it actually solves a whole bunch of problems for business, and gives them a reason to take their first look at Bitcoin. They discover other ways that their businesses can use it.
Sure. I like to think of Bitcoin as among many other things, but an operating system. So if Bitcoin is an operating system, would Metanet be the UI, or would it be a user interface option, or is that an unfair oversimplification?
Well, I think the user interface would probably be the browser wallet. Well, say browser wallet, it's a thing that's a combination of the two. So that's the part that's responsible for peering into the what's on the blockchain and compiling it and assembling it into something meaningful for a user to interact with. But yeah, I actually like that analogy of Bitcoin as an operating system. It's got a lot of the key features of it. I mean, it's got storage, it's got a permission system, it's got security, but also conveniently has money, which is an added bonus.
Sure. So that kind of wraps up my question set. I'm curious, like, if we could spend like 5-ish minutes and maybe get to know who is Steve Shadders when he's not speaking about Bitcoin. What's your do you have hobbies? What do you spend your time doing? I know you work a ton of hours and you're on Twitter, it seems like, when you're off, but what are your hobbies? Do you do anything for fun?
Okay, well, the answer to this question is pretty sad, actually. On my time off, I write code for Bitcoin.
Okay.
I do have outside interests, I guess. In fact, I saw a really interesting presentation during CoinGeek Week's Miners Day from a company that had managed to combine my three sort of primary interests. Now, don't ask me why, but I personally have an interest in using earth tubes for cooling houses, piping air underground where temperature remains relatively constant. They had then combined this with a server farm, or rather a mining farm, so that we're using the cool air to cool the servers.
Sure.
You then ended up with a whole bunch of hot air, which they were then feeding into a bunch of greenhouses, which contained my other interest, which is interested in aquaponic and hydroponic food production. In fact, I used to have a whole setup back in Australia, but it's a bit cold and not quite enough space in a London flat. So,
yeah. Well, that's awesome.
The other interest I have is my guinea pigs. Let me grab her and you can say hello.
Sure.
This is little Peanut.
My. Beautiful.
The Peanut came all the way from Australia with us. Man. Probably the world's most expensive guinea pig.
Is it a he or a she?
It's a she. Yeah, she rules this house with an iron fist.
That sounds like my cat. Well, it's very cool. So
what do they say? Dogs have masters and cats have staff.
Exactly. Yeah, no, I've got a dog he's a pit bull, but he's completely worthless, and the cat is definitely the queen of the house. So, so is there anything I missed? Is there anything you wish people would ask you about Bitcoin?
It's the kind of question that as soon as we end this this video, I'm going to think of something and go. Nothing is leaping to mind at the moment. Just that, I guess, I'd just like to say it's actually like a ridiculously fun thing to work on. If you're a geek like me, I'm having a great time with it. But once we got past November, I had a fantastic time playing around with stuff in over Christmas and early January, messing about with things that we could use, experimenting with things we could use to speed it up. I learned a whole bunch of stuff that I didn't know before about how Bitcoin works internally and how it could work. But one thing I definitely learned was I have absolutely zero reservations about our ability to get to terabyte blocks. In fact, I'm now feeling like we're probably going to hit that target a lot sooner. There's nothing structurally or architecturally in Bitcoin that's going to be a big barrier to that. We just have to think outside the box a little bit, the scaling problem is just a whole bunch of smaller problems that you can break down, and many of those have been solved outside of the Bitcoin world.
Sure.
But it's fun to solve the others. So I think that's good for Bitcoin because it's obviously not just me. There's many others, but at its heart, there's a whole bunch of people that love what they're doing.
Sure.
And probably would be doing it, regardless of whether we were in chainers or not, given the opportunity.
Sure. Very cool. Well, thank you so much for your time, Steve. I appreciate you coming on. And really everything you contribute to Bitcoin and the theory and the code and everything else. But I appreciate your thought leadership, and I really appreciate you coming on the show today.
No worries. Thank you very much for having me.
For sure. So that's it, everybody. The interview with Steve Shadders, lead technical director at nChain and head of the Bitcoin Satoshi Vision project. Steve was a lot of fun. Had a good time talking to him off camera, off script a little bit. He's a super cool guy. You can find him at Shadders333 on Twitter. Feel free to ping him a message, ask him what he thinks of stuff. He's candid. He's fun on the internet, and he's just an all over knowledgeable guy. We talked a little bit about like what he likes to do in his free time and stuff, and he likes to do code for Bitcoin. So feel free, bug him, and don't be afraid to subscribe to us on YouTube, Google, SoundCloud, iTunes, and everywhere else you can consume podcasts and everything else. Of course, you can also find us at CryptoTradersPro.com or join any of our groups available on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. So thanks for listening, everybody. Please subscribe. I'm Kurt Wooker Jr. signing off, and hope to see you folks on the moon.